I've shared a bit of my story of going into the priesthood at other times in places. So some of you have heard a bit of this already, and so you can read the bulletin as I sort of begin the sermon, then pick it up, a bit after we get going here. I keep on my bookshelf in my office here at St. Mark's this replica of you can't really see it, but it's the unnamed Picasso statue that sits in the Daly Center in downtown Chicago. It's kind of a Chicago kind of landmark sort of thing. It's been there for years. And I received it as a gift from the partners at Arthur Anderson and Company when I took a job leaving the Chicago office, and I went up to Minneapolis, and I look at the dates on this, back in 1987. It's a little scary to see those dates and think, I remember that like yesterday. But I look at this Picasso probably a dozen times a day, not because I have necessarily fond and wonderful memories of my work at Arthur Anderson. I look at it because it is a symbol. It's a reminder. It is an icon of God's call to me, a call to keep following the desires of my heart by answering the call of God's love for me that has led me, to this day and literally to this moment of standing here as your priest. You see, when I began life at Arthur Anderson, God rest her soul, may she rest in peace, I had just graduated from the University of Wisconsin with a master's degree in communications and communications research, and of all things, I just can't even believe it's statistics. And I was going to match that with this undergraduate degree in journalism and have a career in public relations. So after 5 years at Arthur Anderson, I was not at all satisfied, despite doing pretty well. And if you can stay in one of those firms for more than a couple years, you're mildly doing well. So I'd been there for about 5 years, and yet I was falling deeper and deeper into a kind of a hole of frustration and joylessness and kind of an internal turmoil and uncertainty. So I thought, well, maybe a transfer to another office in another city would help change things. So I accepted a transfer from Chicago up to Minneapolis, and I moved what was then Karen, and we had one son, Nate, at that point. And as much as we really loved the Twin Cities as a place to live, nothing changed. After 4 more years, the uncomfortable feeling in the pit of my stomach, that kind of gnawing in the back of my head, and the restlessness of my soul really only grew stronger. What I had planned to do with my life was quite literally eating me up on the inside, even if I looked, really doing well on the outside. Without all the pieces of my life not necessarily fitting well together, I would have never, ever picked up the telephone to call my best friend, who's an Episcopal priest. He's a monk who lives out at the Society of St. John the Evangelist, a Anglican monastic order up off of Harvard Square up in Cambridge. And I say to him, Kurt, I think I want to be a priest. And I can to this day hear him chuckling behind the phone saying, Father Lundberg, he was the rector, Kurt was the associate, and Father Lundberg was the rector of this parish up in Chicago that we belong to. He said, Father Lundberg and I have been wondering how long it was going to take for you to call. And I keep this miniature Picasso to remind me that God is always at work in me, leading me to the life God knows is kind of best. Using my fears, those anxieties we carry, the worries, the tensions, the uncertainties, the disappointments, the angst, the frustrations, God using those as means of grace that enable God to bring new life, from my old ways. Our first call as human beings, of course, is not a call by God to go do. It is a call by God to be. We are human beings. We're not human doings. Our first call comes from God, who wants us to know and to believe, as the psalmist reminds us this morning, that you and I are fearfully and wonderfully made by God, knit together in our mother's wombs. The Old Testament prophet Isaiah, who this morning is speaking to us out of absolute frustration and disappointment as he labors in vain and spends his life preaching to people who will not listen, to people who just close their eyes and don't pay any attention to what he's saying. And it's frustrating. But then Isaiah reminds himself that the Lord called me before I was born, while I was in my mother's womb. I'm sorry, this is painful. It's one way to stay awake back in the corner. Isaiah reminds himself in this psalm, he's actually extremely frustrated, but he said, I have to remember that the Lord called me to this, that I'm unique. Isaiah remembers that he's not just anybody, not just a number or a statistic. He is Isaiah. He is unique, and he's precious and honored in the sight of the Lord. And the same is true for you as it is for me. There's a beautiful phrase in Paul's letter to the Ephesians which tells us how God regards us. The Jerusalem Bible translates this phrase as, you are God's work of art. And yet God gives us this freedom to follow the devices and the desires of our own hearts. God even frees us to damage and to tear God's precious works of art. Just look at the world today, which Isaiah looked out and thought the same thing about his world in that day. I won't even begin to name the endless ways in which humans degrade humans, hurting and damaging each other. As we pause this weekend, and in gratitude for the prophetic witness of Martin Luther King Jr., we are reminded, whether we want to see it or admit it or not, we are reminded that race and class and creed and gender are not equal. The struggle for justice never ends, and the powerful will always, always walk all over the weak. And then look at yourself. Just like me, looking at this Picasso, you're reminded that over the years we damage ourselves by not honoring the truth that lies deep within us. The longings of our hearts that, if followed, if we just took the risk to follow them, would lead us to the life we seek. You forget that God has formed you from the beginning, and He's called you and named you in your mother's womb out of love, for love, to love, not to do. It was Paul's conviction that God has not left us alone to our own devices, however. Paul says that in Jesus Christ, God has given us the means to mend, to kind of fix this broken work of art, to repair the broken canvas of God's creation. Through union with Christ, walking as companions with Jesus, we receive grace and power to become those unique and beautiful works of art whom God has created you to be. I think this is just a lovely story. Coming into fellowship with Jesus is told in that gospel reading that we just all heard Mimi proclaim. Jesus is walking by, and there are these two disciples of John the Baptist, his cousin, who begin to follow Jesus. Well, Jesus somehow knows they're there, right? He kind of stops and turns, and he sees that they're following him. And he says to them, "What are you looking for?" The very first time Jesus speaks in John's gospel is that question. That question about our identity, our purpose, our uniqueness, our unique humanity. They say, "Rabbi, where are you staying?" And he replies, "Come and see." They're not asking, like, "Can we come and have a beer with you tonight and a burger?" In John's gospel, these words that we read on the page, they're just words on the page, but you got to dig deep. There's a spiritual meaning to every single one of those words. And one of John's favorite words is this Greek word menein, which means to stay, to remain, to abide. It is a word loaded with spiritual meaning. On the surface, these disciples, like I said, they're kind of asking, "So where are you spending the night? We kind of want to hang with you." But they're not asking that geographical question. They're asking a profoundly spiritual one. When the word is translated abide, it describes a much deeper relationship of union and fellowship with Jesus. Who are you, Jesus? Where do you abide so that we may abide in you and you in us? And Jesus does that amazing invitation to come. Just come and see so that you can abide with me and I in you. Apart from me, you cannot know the depth of my love for you. For you, Jesus says, are precious in my sight. And it is in this abiding with Christ, this fellowship with Christ, that God is able to do that redeeming and restoring work on us, literally putting us back together again. The broken and the disparate parts of our lives beginning to make sense when we abide in Christ and Christ in us. The picture is made whole, this work of art. You are right, complete. When I was growing up, we would spend, these 2 glorious weeks off during Christmas break up there in Wisconsin in a home much smaller than the home most of us living here. And, you'd be out with your friends and you'd be sledding or skating or something, hopefully outdoor, but you'd come right back in and all the junk would be laying around the house. And that was back in the days, right, where there was one TV in the house with basically 5 or 6 channels and like the children and mom frustrated. And so you knew she was getting frustrated when she would go get a cardboard table out of the closet and she'd bring out a box that was a puzzle. And she'd say, "Here, do a puzzle." And you're like, I don't really like puzzles even to this day. And so we would all sit around it, and it was like, right away everything becomes kind of a competition. And how fast can we get this thing done and whatever. And I'm pushing and shoving so hard, deep down knowing that this piece doesn't fit. It was just going to mess up that finished picture. One time I had, you could see yourself undoing a whole row of pieces that I'd put together that I knew didn't fit. It's just the easy way out. Like that puzzle. Have you ever made some wrong choices that just don't fit into this work of art that God has created you to be? Where might you go back and change course, kind of make a new start, lest a wrong fit spoil the whole picture? Where are the Picassos in your life, that remind you when those pieces don't fit and the picture's not so clear? And even more significantly, I think, if you had to paint a picture of your own life, what would it look like? And if you could see that picture that God paints for your life, what do you imagine that to look like? How does God see you? You who are marvelously made. You who are God's work of art. Amen.